Oh yes, that's just, we tend to record all of our events from now on. I'm going to introduce our two speakers briefly, and then I'm going to basically throw them one question to start them off, and then they're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. Sarah Lee Whitson is the former executive director of DAWN, Democracy for the Arab World Now, which was an organization founded by Jamal Khashoggi before his assassination. And it's a group that seeks to support democracy and human rights in the Middle East, and hold abusers accountable, and especially reform U.S. foreign policy in the region. I'm sorry. Oh, do you want us to? No, Zainab, can you raise the mic? Can you raise the speaker volumes?
Oh, speaker volume, yes.
Yeah, we'll raise the speaker volume for you. Before Sarah Lee joined, well, no, this is now, I guess, 2 movies ago, because you just left DAWN. So before DAWN, Sarah Lee was the executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division from 2004 until 2020, where she oversaw the work of that division in 19 countries with staff in 10 countries of the MENA region. Sarah Lee led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the region, focusing on armed conflict, human rights, accountability, legal, and reform policy. She's published widely on human rights and foreign policy in the Middle East and international and regional media, including the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, CNN, and other outlets. And she also appears on many broadcast outlets. Sarah Lee graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, and Harvard Law School, and she's fluent in English, Arabic, and Armenian. Michael Omer-Man is an investigative researcher and policy analyst whose work focuses on accountability for crimes and human rights violations in Israel-Palestine. Michael is currently the Israel-Palestine director at DAWN, which he joined after working as a journalist in the region for nearly 2 decades, including a stint as editor-in-chief of 972 magazine and as an editor at the Jerusalem Post. Michael is an expert on politics and society in the region, with a focus on Israel's policies of occupation and annexation, its civil rights and human rights record, and the influence of the U.S.-Israel relationship in those areas. Together, they wrote this book, and we asked them to speak here as part of a tour they're doing on this book, because it's so relevant. Is anyone having trouble hearing? Is the sound okay now? Okay. Okay, well, we can, Zainab, you can raise it a little bit more. I think, so one central premise of your book is that for 3 decades, basically since the Oslo period, there's been an illusion, and you call it an illusion of a 2-state solution under the auspices of Oslo, and the system that emerged under Oslo, backed by the international community, that essentially allowed Israel to maintain a 1-state reality of permanent occupation and apartheid. And I think that's where the title of the book comes from. So both of you have had decades of experience in the region on the ground in a variety of ways, in advocacy, in journalism, in human rights. And so I guess I'd like you to start off by talking about how you came to this approach, the idea of putting together a blueprint, right, based on trying to shatter the solution that still many hold on to in the U.S. and especially in U.S. foreign policy circles. So if we can start with that, and then we'll take the conversation onward.
That's actually a perfect place to start, because it's where we typically start these presentations, which is the genesis of this project and the genesis of this effort to come up with a new plan for peace, a new plan to address some of the most urgent problems in Israel-Palestine, and to fill the void left by the failure of the Oslo process two-state solution. I really became motivated to think about the answer to the question of what should we do based on an interesting train ride I had from New York to Washington, where I ended up quickly discovering that I was sitting next to a gentleman who worked with AIPAC, and I could see from his computer that he was reviewing AIPAC talking points, and we started talking. We had just released a report at Human Rights Watch concluding that Israel was committing the crime of apartheid. And so we had a long debate and discussion that culminated in him quite exasperated, saying, well, fine, what if I acknowledge it's apartheid? What if we acknowledge it's a permanent occupation? What's the solution? You know, you're saying the Oslo process two-state solution is dead, and I actually agree with you, but what do you want us to do? Jump in the seat? And I realized at that moment that I didn't have a answer to his question, because while I and Mike had spent many years, decades in fact, investigating, documenting, critically analyzing the human rights abuses, the violations of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, the disregard of the Geneva Conventions, which governs how military occupations may be conducted, I didn't really take responsibility for or have a solution. And while Mike and I sort of excelled at criticism of the failure of the Oslo process two-state solution, we had never, you know, occupied the space of trying to come up with something new. And, you know, that challenge was an intellectual challenge, and one that, you know, really I think required Mike and I to flex our intellectual capacities in ways that we weren't particularly expert at. But it was also a, you know, dare I say, spiritual or emotional challenge, which is we felt like we were faced with a catastrophe. We're faced with a great deal of despair, and there was a real absence of hope. And so the challenge also became, can we generate an idea and a vision and a blueprint that can give people hope, that can allow us to imagine a different future? Because in our day and time, hope seems to be the hardest work of all. It really seems impossible to imagine a different scenario, a different reality than the one that has been rigidly and defiantly in place in Israel and Palestine. And that has been this nearly 70 years of military occupation, counting since 1967, expanding settlements, expanding annexation, a situation where Israel's ruling by what every human rights organization who's examined the question has concluded is apartheid rule. And in the wake of the catastrophe in Gaza and the ongoing genocide there, it seems that really the only so-called realistic option that seems the most likely outcome in Israel-Palestine, if we look at what's happening on the ground right now, is, you know, the total extermination of Palestinians and the total displacement of Palestinians from their homes, from their ancestral homelands, unless we could imagine a radically different path. And with the current power dynamics, of course, of Israel supported by the world's greatest superpower, the United States, now engaging in wars, not just in Palestine, of course, but throughout the region, it's very hard to imagine a different reality. And that's really where the challenge is one that's not only Mike's and mine, but a challenge for our audience. Because we need you in order to engage with the ideas that we're putting forward in the blueprint to suspend your disbelief, to suspend your despair that the world can be a different place. And really what we're trying to do is to imagine if it could be a different place, how would we reconstruct Israel-Palestine such that there is freedom and justice and inequality, democratic governance for the people who live between the river and the sea in Israel and Palestine, such that the ongoing crimes there are not ongoing, but that people living there have an opportunity to try to solve their problems the way that many of us in democratic societies or quasi-democratic societies try to figure out whatever challenges in governance and society that we face. But the part of it that I found sort of most interesting and most important is, well, personally, is an opportunity to act as penholders. For those of us engaged as human rights, foreign policy analysts and critics, to move beyond, to try to be the penholders for the future and not cede that space to those whose plans are, in fact, wedded to ideals and ideologies of genocide and extermination. We are, despite the very horrible circumstances, I think, in fact, it's created an opening for recognizing that what is in place in Israel-Palestine is a catastrophe, and that the Oslo two-state process, two-state solution process, has failed. I think there's quite broad consensus among political analysts in the region. There have been books written about this. One just came out by Rob Malley and Hussein Agha, who were involved in negotiations for the Oslo process and who've just sort of underlined their own conclusion that it's failed. But now the international community is somewhat seized of the matter, at least compared to where they were before October 7 and the war that followed October 7 in Gaza, which was moving from a place which I'm sure Mohammed recognizes, of people asserting that the Palestine issue was not relevant anymore, was not something anyone was interested in talking about. It was, you know, stagnant and quiet and docile. And in fact, the main policy prescriptions for the region focused on normalizing Israel with Arab dictatorial regimes, primarily in the Gulf, but also, of course, Morocco, even Sudan. And, you know, the Palestinians could just be ignored. And that, of course, completely blew up in 2023 and put the question of what to do about Israel-Palestine back on the center table of discussion. Of course, policymakers are still clinging to the carcass of the Oslo process two-state solution, and there was a big two-state conference, I guess over a year ago now, headed by Saudi Arabia and France, in their effort to revive a conversation about a pathway for statehood, which is how it's typically framed. But in fact, what's still missing is a credible, actionable plan for what comes next. And that void, that absence of a plan, a peace plan, a conflict resolution plan, whatever you want to call it, is actually quite convenient for Israel, which has long clung to the idea of a so-called managed occupation. The occupation could continue in perpetuity and just be managed. But I think that, in fact, has blown up. So if there is a silver lining in the horrors we've seen in the past few years, is that it has, I think, I hope, opened a space for new ideas to try to assert themselves. There is a policy link that we are trying to fill with the blueprint, and that is that, as I mentioned, the international community has not been able to articulate any positive policy demands or vision for how to end Israeli occupation and apartheid and respect the rights of self-determination and equality for all of the people living in Israel and Palestine. There are many in Israel and Palestine, many activists, lawyers, human rights investigators, civil society representatives who have visions for an alternative future that they'd like to see, whether it's the Land for All movement or the One Democratic State initiative, those who have models of a binational state, a confederation, but they don't provide a roadmap for how to get there. Mike and I spent a lot of time talking to everyone who was promoting sort of a new end goal for Israel-Palestine, and we realized and we recognized, and I think they conceded, that they didn't have a plan for how to get there. And so it's created a dilemma for even those who want to use political pressure, international political pressure on Israel to push forward on sanctions, to push forward with divestment, to push forward with measures and moves to press the government of Israel to end its occupation and apartheid rule, is that there's no actual off-ramp for what should replace those regimes. And that's the gap that we're trying to fill with the blueprint, with the hopes that it can fill the void, fill the gap of a positive policy prescription of what to do should we succeed in compelling Israel to end its occupation and apartheid rule. So, did we say the starting point is where we were gonna, or? So the starting point for our analysis, there are a number of facts that we take notice of. There are a number of legal conclusions that we take notice of, and is really the starting point for the blueprint. One is that we acknowledge that there is a one-state reality. This is a term that is now broadly used in the foreign policy discussions, a one-state reality with Israel as the effective sovereign over all of Israel, but also all of Palestine, that the occupation of the Palestinian territories is illegal. This is a conclusion that the International Court of Justice also reached in 2024 in its advisory opinion, and supported by the UN General Assembly resolution that followed the ICJ opinion, with a resolution ordering Israel to end its illegal occupation as rapidly as possible, giving Israel a deadline of a year to do so. A deadline that is passed, but significantly also mandating that the states of the international community, which, you know, nearly vast, I think 80–90% of the countries who voted in support of the resolution, demanding that states take all actions to end support for Israel's occupation, and that includes ending trade and business relations, withdrawing diplomatic representation, and all the other sort of civil and political tools that we want states to use, as opposed to sort of military incursions for regime change, such as the one underway in Iran right now. We take notice of the legal conclusion that this one-state regime is an apartheid regime. As I mentioned, every organization, international law organization, human rights organization, UN bodies who have looked at this question have concluded that Israel's policies and practices towards the Palestinian people under their control amounts to, or the crime of apartheid under the Apartheid Convention. We recognize that Gaza remains occupied territory, whether or not there's a declared ceasefire, and of course it's a ceasefire in name only, and that a genocide is still underway. Again, the conclusion reached by the International Genocide Scholars Association and numerous human rights organizations that study the question of genocide, that have concluded that indeed Israel is committing genocide. What the blueprint tries to do is to solve two central problems, and in doing so offers a plan that I think is quite radical in breaking with past failed approaches. The failed approach of the Oslo process and the often failed approaches of in sort of the broader world of peace and conflict resolution. So number one, this plan is radical in reordering the problems that even Oslo tried to solve. It does this by prioritizing first ending the crimes, the crime of illegal occupation and the crime of apartheid, ahead of questions of governance and statehood. What the Oslo process proposed was to end Israeli occupation, but conditional on resolving first the questions of statehood and governance. And because the questions of statehood and governance were not resolved, the crime of this permanent occupation remained the status quo. So we reversed that order by saying, first we must end these crimes. Secondarily, we must address the issues of statehood and governance, because we cannot resolve the questions of statehood and governance while the occupation and apartheid rule remain in place. And that also is important to emphasize, because crimes must end unconditionally. We cannot condition the ending of crimes on what others somewhere in the world or Palestinians do or don't do, because the demand of the international community, the International Court of Justice, the UN General Assembly, those analyzing international law, the sort of basic principle is crimes must end unconditionally. The second way in which the blueprint is a radical approach is in its very radical commitment to democracy and democratic decision making. So it breaks from prior or other efforts at conflict resolution that designate or appoint representatives to decide on behalf of two conflicting parties what the resolution should look like. So in the case of Israel-Palestine, Israeli representatives deciding for all Israeli Jews what the questions of future governance or statehood should look like, Palestinian representatives deciding for all Palestinians what questions of their statehood and governance should look like, and we reject that approach. And we reject it for two principal reasons. One is that we believe that self-determination is an individual right, and the questions of statehood and governance should be decided democratically by the people who live there. And second is because we reject an approach that flattens the people in the region into a singular identity. So their identity as Israeli Jews, as the one and unique and only relevant factor about them, such that any Israeli Jew can decide for all Israeli Jews. And for Palestinians, the only relevant feature of their humanity is their identity as Palestinians, such that a Palestinian representative can decide for all Palestinians. So we reject that approach, nor do we want to validate or give more authority to the undemocratic, corrupt, lacking in electoral legitimacy Palestinian representatives of the Palestinian Authority, or the criminally indicted leadership representatives of the Israeli government, who are also, of course, the ones responsible for continuing the crimes of occupation and apartheid. And so what we propose instead, in order to achieve that democratic decision-making about governance, preceded by the ending of occupation and apartheid, these two crimes, is the establishment of a transitional government, a caretaker government, in the territory of Israel and Palestine that would serve the narrow and limited functions of ending apartheid and occupation and creating the groundwork for democratic decision-making in the territory, such that the people who live there at the conclusion of a 3-year transitional process can democratically decide what their future governance should look like, whether one state or two states. But if that fails, if that referendum at the conclusion of the 3-year transitional process fails, then the default is a democratic state without occupation and apartheid. And in that way, we think it's a much superior plan to the Oslo process two-state solution. I'm going to pass it on to Mike.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us here. Thanks, everybody, for attending. As Sarah Lee said, you know, we set out to solve these 3 issues. And they can be boiled down to effectively, as Sarah Lee said in many more words, transforming an undemocratic one-state reality into a democratic one in lieu of any other process that might change it or end these crimes. The way that we do this is, sorry, and I'm going to just give one more note here, which is that the sort of how we believe this can be used and why this is useful, as Sarah Lee mentioned in the beginning, is that, you know, there's lots of diplomats and policymakers and leaders and analysts out there who understand this reality, but simply do not have the courage, do not have the imagination to propose or to endorse or to even consider any alternative paths because they're largely undefined. And the status quo compared to the void is almost always preferable, certainly for Israel and its allies and supporters. And the easiest example, again, is that, you know, if Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and all these other organizations are successful, if the BDS movement is successful in convincing the world that Israel's an apartheid regime 15 years from now, what's the off-ramp? What is the actual positive demand of Israel? Because getting those people to put that pressure is almost impossible if there's not a positive demand attached to it. So, our plan, as Sarah Lee mentioned, is based on a 3-year transition, and the transition is designed to accomplish those 3 goals of dismantling apartheid, ending the occupation, and creating the democratic framework. We, you know, went into our Rolodexes of decades of working in these issues in the region, interviewed lots and lots of people, stakeholders, scholars, politicians, lawyers. We did comparative research into other post-colonial and democratic transitions, not because we thought we could find the one-size-fits-all answer, but because the problems in place in Israel-Palestine are not unique. They are things that have existed and come and gone and still exist in many other places, including this country. And there are lots of ways to address them if you sort of disaggregate the system as a whole. And of course, this was published by UC Press, so it was underwent peer review by 5 scholars. Before I get to the next slide, I just want to say that while we talk about a democratic transition and a transitional government, there is a step in how you get there, and the pressure that would lead to getting to such a place, because a transitional government cannot be imposed from the outside, although the pressure to get there can be. And Israelis, Jewish Israelis, because they hold all the power today, and they're not ceding it, they are the ones who need to effectively be convinced that their sort of fundamental beliefs and political identity and system of governance, which, you know, for them may be democratic, but for Palestinians is apartheid and occupation, is no longer worth it. That there has to be a better path forward. So that's our starting point, where the political will exists. And the question is, what do you do then? So our process starts with a sort of conciliation conference to elect a transitional government. This is taken through a consociational model that sort of, you know, through very imperfect means tries to preserve balance in political power and to prevent one side from sort of taking over the process. And that caretaker government is locally led with international supervision, primarily from the UN, but other sort of experts and folks who've, hold the wisdom in places where this has been tried and succeeded, and tried and failed. And as I said, it transforms undemocratic one-state reality into a more democratic one. Doing so effectively creates one government over the whole territory. And the first steps are adopting the plan and its guiding principles, which are largely based on human rights principles and of democracy and equality. And we can get into any of the more technical aspects of this. And I have to say that it's not just the idea that we're pitching here. There's an actual granular, like what happens on day one plan here to prove to policymakers that this is possible, that it's possible to do something. Dismantling occupation is slightly simpler than dismantling apartheid. You basically revoke a few military orders and all of the authorities that grant the Israeli army the powers, the legal powers at least, to rule over Palestinians effectively disappear overnight. This includes extending Israeli civilian law, primarily criminal law, to all, revoking emergency regulations and laws which are used to restrict movement, to lock people up without charge or trial, administrative detention, and many other of the mechanisms that Israel has used over the years to dominate and oppress and control Palestinians, including rescinding the jurisdiction of military courts to judge civilians, fully restoring freedom of movement on day one. This is not, controlling movement and who can be where is another one of the sort of major ways that Israel has controlled the Palestinian population over the years, whether it's preventing refugees from returning or giving people different status in different places and primarily disenfranchising them. But we recognize that this is not an easy thing, and there are reasons why it hasn't been done. And so there are certain compromises that we believe have to be made, including leaving many of the checkpoints in place on a temporary basis, but transforming them from places where people are turned away on a categorical basis to something more akin to TSA of a few days ago before ICE was deployed there, where they're simply screening for contraband. With regards to external borders, it effectively turns it into a normal border situation, again, where there's no categorical bans on entry or exit, and I'll get into some of the things here actually in a later slide. Another thing that we discovered, which we both already knew when we entered this project, but which became increasingly clear, is that the law and the judiciary were tools to support and entrench and codify the systems of apartheid and occupation, and not ones that had been restraining or even holding them off. And therefore we decided that it would be necessary to replace the Israeli High Court of Justice with a High Court for the Transition, which is charged with effectively shepherding and overseeing this transitional period and making sure it doesn't stray from its purpose. There's obviously a process very similar to what happened in South Africa of revoking racist and discriminatory laws. This happens in two stages. On day one, there's a whole long list of laws that can be immediately revoked. And we didn't come up with this ourselves. Palestinian civil and human rights organizations have been creating databases of these for decades. However, there's the system of apartheid permeates the entire judicial and legislative and entire governmental system in Israel, and therefore there has to be a much more nuanced and extensive process of going through everything to ensure that there's not sort of hidden discrimination and ways of oppression within more seemingly benign laws and regulations. This includes another major one, which is a review of the land regime and a reformation of the land regime, transferring public lands from agencies like the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization to the state, which at this point is actually representative of and accountable to the people, to all people. This seems like almost a given, but giving citizenship to everybody living within the territory. And we do not include Palestinian refugees outside of the territory in this, not on an ideological basis, not because we think that that they don't have the rights of all refugees, the right of return, but because we had to sort of tackle a very discrete problem, and that problem is the regimes of apartheid and occupation within the territory that Israel currently controls. But you'll see in a second we get to that in a few minutes, or a few steps later. The integration of security forces is a big part of this. It's one of the ones that's harder to imagine actually succeeding when you look at the different security forces involved and what they've been charged with doing, and the sort of the ethos and the purpose that they've been given. It begins by a strict separation, similar to Posse Comitatus in the United States, where civilian police are responsible for everything within the domestic area of the territory, and external security is something that's entirely separate through the integration of Israeli and Palestinian police forces under a central sort of authority, but maintaining principles of local policing, so that Palestinian police in Gaza are still policing in Gaza, and Israeli police in Tel Aviv are still policing in Tel Aviv, obviously with major changes, but still the people who are a part of those communities primarily. An extensive lustration process to ensure that the people responsible for the worst abuses don't remain or gain power. A comprehensive, and this is not something that is easy or happens overnight, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program. This is something that there's lots of expertise on in the world, but it's effectively it's taking people who are part of irregular forces or illegal forces in the past and giving them a pathway to integrate either into state security forces or into civilian life in other ways. A new security doctrine that defines the role of security forces in serving all of the people and the democratic goals of this transitional government. And of course, if you're going to deal with things like Israel's nuclear arsenal, you have to think of a broader sort of regional and international security guarantees that will convince Israelis that that is something that they can, if not give up, then at least cede full control over. Although one place where I think we struggled a lot in this, but do believe that we found the right balance is transitional justice. We largely do not answer all the questions involved in transitional justice, although we believe them to be crucial to moving forward. And the reason we did that is because our plan does not endorse any specific outcome, meaning we don't endorse a two-state solution or a one-state solution or a confederation or a federation or broader regional integration, but rather the idea that the Israeli and Palestinian people can decide for themselves once the political playing field has been leveled with this dismantlement of apartheid and occupation. And what those transitional justice steps might look like will be highly dependent on what that outcome is. And we don't want to predetermine or prejudge what's possible. There are a few areas where we do believe that immediate steps can be taken, like the release of political prisoners, the restoration of property that's not currently being occupied, and there's a significant amount of it, the return of movable property, like books and other things that Israel has taken over the years and put into its national archives and libraries, which they know who it belongs to, but they just refuse to return. And some symbolic and some concrete steps toward the Palestinian refugee population outside of the territory, including allowing the immediate return of people who are facing a credible risk to themselves or their families, family unification for first-degree relatives, begin the establishment of a refugee ministry, which is responsible for supporting and building connections with the refugee population, similar to how the Jewish Agency treated, Soviet Jews and others who did not necessarily have a friendly state to act on their behalf, and build a menu, a very developed menu of policy options for the government that comes after the transition, of how to actually address these issues in the long term in a way that people can live with, because transitional justice doesn't work if the people who have to live with it can't live with it. It has to be something that allows people to move on. And lastly, this 3-year transition ends with democratic elections, reflecting a similar consociational sort of balance that we described in the beginning. Elections that lead to the first democratic government for the entire territory. And again, we do this not because that is the outcome that we think is the best one, although it might be, but because we again, transforming an undemocratic one-state reality into a democratic one in lieu of any political process that's moving it anywhere, aside from more undemocratic and deeper apartheid and genocide, that is preferable, and that provides the opportunity for democratic decision-making, so that Palestinians and Israelis can decide for themselves once they're no longer shackled by the power imbalances that define the politics of the region today, how they want to live, whether it's one state or two states. And as Sarah Lee mentioned earlier, the key difference here being that if such a referendum fails, the fallback is a democratic state with equality, and not the status quo of apartheid and occupation and at this point, genocide across the territory. So, I think we've covered most of this, but our goals here are twofold. One is to really convince people that there is something that can be done, that if the political will existed tomorrow, if name your favorite politician was elected president, and they decided that, this isn't working for us, we're gonna put actual pressure on Israel, that there is something they could do. And by defining what those steps could be, we hope to create a proof of concept that can actually give people the language and the imagination to entertain such thoughts, and maybe even advocate or adopt them. And the second is an understanding that we came up with one plan here, and we believe in this plan, and its practicality and its implementability. But it's our goal here is to inject vitality into a conversation that's not being had. This sort of binary equation of the status quo or chaos and destruction and a second Holocaust. Well, if you don't like our plan, come up with a better one. But let's talk about what can be done. And that's the conversation we hope to start, whether it's with you or the next president of the United States, whoever that might be, or leaders in the United Nations or across the globe. And the foreign policy community writ large, is that we need to be having this conversation, and we need to be talking about what can be done tomorrow. Because tomorrow's not going to come if we don't know what it could look like, if that path isn't visible, let alone paved. So that is effectively what we have tried to do, and what I think we have done in this book, in the blueprint. And yeah, I'm happy to say more if the people have more questions or to discuss, or if Mohammed, do you want to, if I've seen you scribbling, if you have any more questions, maybe we can start there.
I do. I'm tempted. I have a lot of questions. I also, I'm interested if you, maybe, thank you. Just I'll use questions. I can't help but think of the current moment of the war spreading to Iran, to Lebanon, to the Gaza model being exported, certainly to Lebanon, but also in some part, in some ways to Iran, of mass displacement of civilians, of preparing the ground for a larger invasion, larger occupation. In a year we could be talking about a renewed Israeli, or not even a year, in a few months, a renewed Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, sort of to bring us back to 1978 into 2000. And I guess, so all of that, all those regional forces moving this way, I guess does that dampen hope, Sarah Leah? Does that dampen the possibility?
I mean, certainly the present moment is a terrible one and a catastrophic one. And we want to believe that it is not something that Israelis or Palestinians or the people of the region or the people of the world want to see continue. One of the things that we think has stymied positive progress in Israel-Palestine is the lack of a plan, a lack of a vision or a practical solution, a peace plan, because we all know Oslo has failed and nothing's been there to replace it. Certainly what gives me hope is the fact that the vast majority of the world is opposed to what Israel's doing. Indeed, now even the majority of Americans, if not the vast majority of Democrats, are opposed to what Israel's doing. And that at some point that must translate into political action and policy action. So frankly, if there's no hope for Israel-Palestine, then there's no hope for US democracy or democracies either. Because if US policy supporting Israel doesn't change, that represents the failure of democracy in the United States. So it's a bigger problem in a sense. But if the democratic levers of decision-making can function, and they may well function after Trump leaves office, and we see where the political winds are blowing in the United States among both Democrats and Republicans, there will be a change in US position, and the Europeans will follow up behind that. And what we need is a way to solve it, a way that respects and seeks to respect the security needs, the equality needs, the self-determination needs of everybody who lives in Israel-Palestine right now.
I have a slightly different answer, which is that this moment that we're living in, and focusing on the parts of this moment that Israel is directly affecting and directing, we're clearly seeing movement in the exact opposite direction that we're talking about here. And it's as you said, it's going backwards in time to the reoccupation of Gaza, to the reoccupation of southern Lebanon, in both cases far more extreme than they existed in the past, followed by with much more extreme methodologies of completely clearing Palestinians and Lebanese of the land and effectively turning them into just no man's lands, and this comes at a time when you don't have Ariel Sharon in power anymore. You have Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who openly say that the Litani River should be the new border of Israel, and advocating and pushing and taking practical steps to further control and permanently seize the land, not just in the West Bank, where we've all been focusing on for the past few decades, but in places that we thought were beyond the pale, beyond the scope of that. Now, there's two reasons that none of this gives me hope, but there's two reasons why I'm optimistic that this can lead to a better place. The first is that it's very expensive to control such a large port. Like the military expenditure alone is very huge. The cost to Israeli society is very, very heavy. And we see that manifesting in various ways, and one of those ways is that the people, the sort of liberal, more secular Israelis who have been the backbone of the Israeli economy, are looking elsewhere for a future, and that can happen in a lot of ways. But speaking of ways, Google bought Waze for what? $20 billion, something like that. 30% of that went to the Israeli government. If Israeli startups start, establishing themselves overseas, that's going to deprive the Israeli state of a lot of the financing it needs to maintain this type of expansionism. And so that's one way. The second is that, as Sarah Lee mentioned, public opinion, and not just public opinion, we're seeing it more and more from global leaders, is turning against Israel. They're not quite at the point of saying this is an illegitimate regime, that it's an apartheid regime, that it's a genocidal, or that it's committing the crime of aggression and must be whatever happens after that. But there's a lot of movement. And the more that Israel continues down this path with the impunity that it's been acting over the past 3 years in particular, but decades more generally, the closer we get to that point. And we're in a moment of great global transformation of the international system, of the geopolitical order of the region, and it's my optimistic side says that all of these things can come together in a moment that leads people to an inflection point of we have to try something different. And we had a lot of, I think maybe a little bit more hope at the beginning of the Gaza war and the genocide that could be closer. I think we're probably further from it now than we have been in a long time. But all of the pieces are starting to appear. I mean, they're not in place, but they're starting to appear such that it's possible to imagine such an inflection point, both globally and within Israel.
Thank you both, and let's take other questions.
I'm assuming that Gaza is part of this plan.
Yes.
And I'm very concerned because the focus has completely gone off Gaza since the war has begun. I understand that even food aid has gone down drastically, and there's no movement to rebuild, and nothing's happening. So I'm just wondering, how that's going to play out in your proposal.
I mean, our proposal is for all of the territory between the river and the sea. So all of the state of Palestine and all of the state of Israel is included in the transitional government. That will include Gaza. So, the blueprint does not try to solve everything that needs to be fixed in Israel-Palestine, and the reconstruction of Gaza is obviously a critical piece of that. Not because, it's not critical, but because we've tried to limit and narrowly address the problems that are the main impediment to how to do rehabilitation. And that is the occupation and apartheid rule. Without solving and ending those crimes, and without creating a framework for democratic decision-making, the decisions that will be made about Gaza's reconstruction will be the wrong ones. They'll be bad ones.
And I just say that your question, I think, highlights the urgency of trying to get to a place where all of this is relevant, where something is different. Because, as Sarah Lee mentioned in the beginning, if Israel continues on its current path, that's leading toward the complete eradication of Palestinian society and presence in the entire territory between the river and the sea. At least that's the goal of a lot of people in power and frankly, of a lot of people, of regular Israelis these days.
Hi. Is there any role for the UN in this, or is it too late for that?
I mean, yes, there is. We envision the UN playing a central role in the establishment of a conciliation conference that then elects the representatives of the transitional government. We think that the UN has actually played a very positive role in a number of post-conflict and transitional states around the world. I mean, for all the things that the UN is terrible at, it's actually been pretty successful and made a positive contribution in a number of post-conflict state situations. And we think that Israel-Palestine in particular needs some third party, neutral third party, to help assemble the pieces of this transitional government. So obviously we want the UN to survive, but if it's not the UN, it could be something else, just as long as it's not a pretend intermediary like the United States, which of course is a partisan mediary.
I've been following events in Israel-Palestine since the 1950s, and I cannot think of one year in which the situation of the Palestinians was better than it had been in the prior year. What makes you think that this pattern will change? Number one. Number two, can you name one world leader who is courageous enough to condemn what Israel is doing? Give me one name. South Africans, they don't count.
The Prime Minister of Spain.
They don't count.
The Norwegian government's been pretty critical.
What? To be critical is one thing, to really have the power to do something is...
Power is something else.
So much of that is wound up in the way that the international system is ordered today, though. That, you know, I immediately thinking of the speech that maybe many of you heard the Prime Minister of Canada give at Davos a few months ago, effectively saying that the middle powers, the mid-sized countries of this world, you know, and it was effectively a unionization speech, right? That by banding together, they can have a much greater influence on creating the world that is better for them and for everybody. As long as the United States has a veto on the Security Council, as long as it punishes and threatens to indict leaders who actually speak in the way that you're asking about, like the Prime Minister, President of Colombia, you know, it's almost impossible to ask. With regards to where the hope that it can get better, I mean, I think it's something that drives us both. That if you accept that everything's just going to get worse, then what's the point of even trying? And you know, I do believe, I'm somebody who believes in humanity and that people do evil things, but that ultimately, you know, there's the possibility for change. And that, you know, while oppression and domination and murderous regimes have been very powerful, that things change, and that in that change there is opportunity. And in that opportunity there is hope, and it of course can go the wrong way. But, you know, looking at what's happened in this country in the past year and a half or 10 years maybe, Project 2025 people are the big difference between the first Trump administration and the second one. The first one, they came into power and said, holy shit, we have power, what do we do? The second time, they had, you know, hundreds of points of exactly what to do on day one and day two and day three, and it's transforming the regime. And, you know, without, you know, giving too much credit to these people, they understood that you have to be ready for these moments. And when these moments come, these black swan moments of, you know, the Berlin Wall falling, or apartheid ending, or Black Friday agreements, or the you know, all sorts of things that have happened in history, that if you're not prepared for where to take it, that it will be taken in a different direction by somebody else. And that if we don't have it, then there's no chance. And if we do have it, there's a chance. And a chance is better than no chance.
If you have to change the mind of the Israeli people, I think probably 90% would oppose what you're proposing.
Today, but this is not for today. This is for tomorrow. And tomorrow, in our vision of it, where the political will exists is one where a combination of international, domestic pressure, and, you know, this can come about in far more violent ways as well, but a point where Israelis simply reach you know, overusing the word probably, inflection point where they decide or consider that a different path forward might actually be better for them and their children.
Could I ask about your tomorrow versus today? Because, yeah, if you assume that the Israeli government has a huge incentive right now that is partly acting upon to find a pretext for mass forced displacement, which renders your whole proposal moot. There is some urgency here. And so the assumption is, what's the point of going after Trump? That he's hopeless. And I'm wondering if that's the right attitude. Because, would the US government have ever normalized relations with China if it was a Democratic president? No, because they would have been pilloried by the right. And, Trump has the huge advantage right now of owning the right. So he can act pretty much with impunity. We saw him willing to put pressure on Netanyahu to stop Gaza, late, but he did it. He's clearly not going to be happy with Netanyahu after this whole Iran debacle. And, can we afford to wait another 3 or 4 years? Or should this be something we're pushing on Trump now on the theory that this is a guy who doesn't really believe in anything but himself, and if he sees political advantage, he may just take it?
I'm interested to hear Sarah Lee's answer, but my response to that is we're not writing off Trump. We're acknowledging the fact that we don't have access to him, and if anybody in this room can get us or a copy of our book into Mar-a-Lago, please. You're right. He has done, compared to the Biden administration, which enabled and funded and gave the diplomatic and military backing to allow this genocide to happen, this administration's been far better, at least vis-a-vis Gaza. And if there's a way to we're not banking on a certain politician or a certain moment. We're banking on a moment where the U.S. president, where a critical mass of people in power in the world decide that enough is enough. And if Trump can stop the expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine, then that is very helpful in an otherwise very shitty situation. But we're not writing him off. He's not listening to us.
I guess I would just add, it is incredible the decisiveness of President Trump and the Trump administration. And of course, it's much easier to break things, which he's been breaking all around the world. But if you're a Trump supporter, or if Trump is sort of the person you've been pressing on your issues, you're going to love him, because he's actually delivered, other than the war in Iran, so much of what he promised his electorate. And I only wish that we had a Democratic leader who, would deliver in 4 years what Trump delivered in 100 days to his supporters. So I see the advantage of someone like a Trump who can make a decisive decision to change course on Israel, for example. The war in Iran, of course, makes me think that he is much less independent and much more under the influence of those who wanted this war with Iran, namely Israel and its billionaire backers here in the United States, than I thought. I was hoping that this war wouldn't happen and that he would defy these people who've pushed him into war, but he didn't. So he's shown some weakness in that regard. Is it possible that someone like Trump could read the political winds and say, we're going to change this? He can. I think he could get away with it. He could do it. I just don't know if he has the emotional or moral inclination to prioritize that, to prioritize his politics for something like that. I would love to, as Mike was saying, try to present this. I actually have had 2 meetings with Jared Kushner, one of which where we were discussing the fact, and this was before our book, he was sort of sharing with me this grievance that there's no plan, there's no way out. Like, yes, I agree with you, the 2-state solution, the Oslo process is dead, and nobody's got a plan, nobody knows what to do. And that was, I was surprised by that sense. But right now, with this war in Iran, I'm less hopeful for that kind of a miracle to happen.
I actually read Iran differently. I suspect Trump was pulled into it by, the excitement of this moment of opportunity to kill Khamenei, didn't think through the rest because he didn't think big, long term, and is now stuck with a mess, and he knows it. He doesn't have a way out. And so I think there's going to be a souring of whatever. There wasn't much closeness between the two to begin with. But, he's going to turn on Netanyahu. I think we actually will have an opportunity from this.
New advocacy
So,
plan.
sorry, go ahead. No, so you've used the word inflection point several times, and you've talked about what Israelis need to realize, and I'm curious as to what you think Palestinians need to realize.
I mean, so a critical feature of the blueprint is that it does rely on the consent of the governed. It relies on the consent of Israelis, and it relies on consent of the Palestinians. We think that the consent of the Palestinians will not be difficult to achieve because they want the occupation to end and they want apartheid to end. And it's the apartheid rule over them is one that harms them. So we don't think it's going to be a tough sell. The tough sell is for Israeli Jews, where they are the beneficiaries of this system of occupation and apartheid, and they have all the power. I mean, the Palestinians don't have the power. The power they have is negligible. Whether or not they like something or don't like something doesn't really matter much in the political calculation. So we, I think, recognize that the hard sell is going to be persuading Israeli Jews to give up that power, the way that South Afrikaners gave up their power under apartheid rule. We're not really establishing conditions on Palestinians because you don't earn the right for a crime against you to end, right? Crimes must end. And we're not actually imposing any conditions on Israelis to act or behave in another way. What we're seeking is a consent to this transitional government.
Adding to that, I mean, I think that we're asking effectively the same thing of Israelis and Palestinians if you boil down to the core of it, which is a reconsideration of how to manifest self-determination from a very sort of strict monolithic nation state where one group is in control and the majority of that state to one, that can take other forms. And again, the right to self-determination is a right, but it's not the right to national self-determination. And that can manifest in different ways. And democracy is the easiest way to, and obviously ending the crimes of occupation and apartheid, to give that to people. And it's going to be a harder sell to Israelis because their version of their sort of national political identity wrapped up in Zionism is one of domination and exclusive control. But we're effectively asking them to consider the same thing, which is to imagine a different relationship with the state and a homeland and citizenship and necessarily said that's going to be harder to convince Israelis of because they have it now, and we're offering it to Palestinians, whereas we're asking Israelis to give up in the exclusivity to that sort of political identity and state.
There's been some reference to the end of apartheid in South Africa, and a lot of the correlations are very strong. A couple of the differences, though, is that in South Africa, one of the things that brought about the end of apartheid was the increasing international isolation of the white regime in South Africa, and on the other hand, two unimpeachable leaders like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, who had tremendous clout with the international community. Do you see leadership like this emerging in the Palestinian community?
No, because Israel has spent the last 100 years doing everything it can in myriad ways to prevent the emergence of effective Palestinian leadership and a cohesive Palestinian polity. And while Mandela and Tutu were absolutely, I think, critical in selling white South Africans on the ability to make this kind of compromises that we just spoke about, what we're missing is not a Palestinian Mandela, it's an Israeli de Klerk. It's an Israeli who is willing to actually lead their people in a way that breaks from the norm of domination and supremacy and apartheid to one that tries something different. And getting there obviously includes the international isolation. And there's lots of other ways that South Africa was different. There's no other situation that is exactly like this one. But if we can learn something from the South African experience, it's that, it's almost comical to think of Ariel Sharon this way and with his disengagement from Gaza, but that leaders can change course, that they can look at the world around them, see that something's not working, and say, hey, let's try something different. But also, Mandela was a terrorist in prison until he was president of South Africa, right? Like, he wasn't unimpeachable to most people at the time. And
South Africa, the international community.
well, I think it was George W. Bush who finally got him off the terrorist list here. So it took another 30 years. But yeah, I mean, the problem is not a lack of Palestinian leadership. It's the lack of space to develop that leadership and leveling the political playing field by ending apartheid and occupation, we believe, would make it much more possible to see the emergence of that kind of leadership.
And I would just say that, we are really trying to put forward a vision that breaks out of this binary of Israelis versus Palestinians. We want to define a state, a civil state, where each individual has a secret ballot and votes on a variety of issues, just like people of diverse races and religions in the United States or in many other multi-ethnic, multi-religious states. The voters vote on a variety of issues, and we want to identify the human beings there as human beings and not just their sort of identity faction.
Are there any more questions? Okay.
Thank you. Join us. We have a reception outside. There's also discount codes if you're ordering the book, right?
Yeah, we have the discount coupon for the book here. Feel free to scan the code. I'm sorry, there's no scan, but you can take the code link down and use it. And yeah, we have a reception outside, so feel free to join us.
Thank you to our speakers.
Oh yes, and thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you.